Hey, it's Dr. Sean Price. On this video, I want to talk about something called sympathetic dominance. And this is something that we are finding that most of our patients are dealing with. And so I want to make sure that you have a complete understanding of what this is so that you know how to move forward and what to do with it. So basically, sympathetic dominance is referencing what's called the autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system consists of your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is what we call the feed and breed system. This is basically the part of your autonomic nervous system. Now, first of all, autonomic means automatic. So you have your voluntary nervous system, which is obviously, I'm thinking about holding this pen and I hold this pen, so I have conscious control. Autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that you don't have control over. It's your breathing, it's your respiration, your blood pressure, your heart rate, all these different things, digestion that we don't control. So the parasympathetic nervous system controls our healing, it controls our reproduction, so our hormones and things along those lines, it controls our digestion, it controls all of these different areas. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight. So that's our stress response, that's our self-defense response. Now the key to understanding this is if the sympathetic nervous system goes up, parasympathetic goes down, and vice versa. So if you have sympathetic dominance, it's going to affect hormone function, sexual function, reproductive function, digestive function. And the same thing goes the other way. If you can increase parasympathetic function, you're going to decrease stress function. So our goals in treatment are obviously to make both of those things happen to achieve balance. Neither one ever completely shuts down, but you want to maintain balance with them. You want your body to be able to respond appropriately. So what we find with most patients with metabolic disorders is they end up in a situation of sympathetic dominance, which causes chronic parasympathetic suppression, which leads to hormone dysregulation, which you'll see on other videos from the adrenal glands, leads to digestive disorders because your body is being suppressed. It doesn't produce enough hydrochloric acid. The digestive system doesn't work properly. So sympathetic dominance is very, very detrimental to the body. So one of the ways that this happens through the metabolic pathway is understand that metabolism is taking food and converting food into energy. And also remember that when that energy is created, the nervous system consumes about 30% of that. So the brain and the nervous system consumes up to 30% of all the fuel created. So if you have a metabolic disorder, you're going to have a decrease in brain function if you have decreased fuel. So that's one thing to consider with this. The other thing to consider is also this. The end result of energy is adenotriphosphate, a substance called ATP, okay? It's going to be important as we go through this. So if you have decreased ATP through a malfunctioning metabolic system, which we have a ton of videos that talk about the whole metabolic pathway, adrenals, thyroid, all these different pathways. But if you have a decreased adenotriphosphate because of any of those breakdowns, then this is what can happen. You have a neuron. That neuron, this is the part of the neuron called the axon, and these are the part of the neurons called the dendrite, and these go on to other neurons. Your neuron has what's called a resting membrane potential and a firing threshold. Inside the neuron is potassium, outside of the neuron is sodium. This is the resting state, okay? If an impulse comes in, stimulating that nerve, what will happen is your sodium is pumped in, potassium is pumped out, and your resting membrane potential starts to rise. If this impulse is strong enough to raise that resting membrane potential to hit this firing threshold, this neuron will then fire and go on to all these other neurons and cause a neurological response, okay? So that's a normal neurological pathway. Then adenotriphosphate comes in and is required to actively move the potassium back into the cell and the sodium out of the cell, which brings the nerve back to its resting membrane potential, okay? So that's a normal neurological firing pathway. What if you have decreased adenotriphosphate? If you have too little adenotriphosphate, you're not going to have enough fuel to pump all of the sodium and potassium back to its starting position, so you won't get to that full resting membrane potential. So you end up right here. Now, if another impulse comes through, and let's say this impulse was only enough in this resting membrane potential to stimulate it to here and come back down, that nerve never would have fired. But now, because your resting membrane potential is here, that same small stimulation will hit that firing threshold and cause this neuron to fire. When that happens, you now become hyperactive. You respond to things that normally wouldn't cause a physiological response. So a loud noise would cause a stress response. You're more irritable than usual. Any kind of stressor that comes through causes you to have this stress response, which is a sympathetic response. So as this happens and as this continues on, you get into a state of constant sympathetic firing, which is sympathetic dominance. When you're doing that, that leads to disruption of digestion, disruption of hormones, and so on and so forth. So this is a very vicious cycle, because what can end up happening is you end up having neurological malfunction. Now the brain is not getting the fuel that it should get. You don't have the fuel for normal neurological function. These nerves start to wear out. Then you start having neurological disorders. And not to mention the sympathetic disorder, where your adrenal glands are constantly firing, so you get into adrenal fatigue, leads to depression, anxiety, so on and so forth. So it's a vicious cycle. So one of the things that's important is to not only support whatever metabolic systems are not functioning properly, but you have to get this adenotriphosphate level up to a good level so that your nervous system gets back to a resting membrane potential, because as you're going through this healing process, you may not be able to remove all the stressors from your life, but you can remove your body's over and hyper reactivity to them. By getting back to this resting membrane potential, you get to the point where you can go through a stressor that used to really cause a physiological response and a lot of anxiety, and you just realize all of a sudden that you were able to handle it because you didn't have all this firing. So that is sympathetic dominance. It's very important to understand. If you have any questions about this, please let me know.